And what we saw was no justice from the criminal justice system for the families of for those victims. And despite the facelift by the authorities within this country, you have the police and the prosecution that are still unaccountable. The judiciary still remains immune from the Lawrence recommendations, and quite often when it comes to families whose children have been murdered, and it's the families that have to stand up and fight for justice. It's not the system that hands it to them on the plate. You have families who've never wanted to be campaigners, who have little alternative but to set up justice campaigns. Some of the most celebrated names in civil liberties have actually come to the fore when you talk about Imran Khan, talk about Gareth Pearce and others, come to the fore and described as heroes for going the extra mile. But what the lawyers themselves would say is that it's their clients that are actually courageous. The families who, despite having lost a child, stand up and take on the system. And it's the lawyers who derive their strength from the fight and from the battles that they often have to wage. Trench warfare, as I see, by focusing on the mothers and the fathers who have been forced with the love of their children to become campaigners. And I know there was a case that I became involved in, went right at the start of my legal career, which was a case described as Scottish Stephen Lawrence in 1998. Surjit Singh Chokar, a 31-year-old Indian man, was hacked and murdered on the streets of Lanarkshire by three white men. Three white men were some 3 days later arrested: Ronnie Coulter, Andrew Coulter, and David Montgomery. And what happened was, after the Lawrence inquiry, some 2 weeks later, this is about a year later, Mr. and Mrs. Chokar find out through some neighbour and a newspaper cutting that the trial's going to start. So they go along to Glasgow High Court, and they wander in, and they're told by the policeman, "No, you don't need to come. You don't need to be here," because he couldn't speak very good English. And Mr. Chokar, who had been in the armed forces in India, been in the United Nations, quite an imposing man, tall man, but broken English, said, "It's my son." In his broken English said, "It's my son that died, and I have a right to go in that court," and went to the court. And the family sat in that courtroom for some 2 weeks and watched the trial take place, not of one, not of three men, but of one man, Ronnie Coulter. And they watched, nobody came to speak to them, prosecution, police, nobody bothered to speak to the family, no interpreter provided, nobody bothered to tell them what was happening. And they watched the man, Ronnie Coulter, walk out by blaming the other two and get a not guilty and walk out of court. And several days later, he had it tattooed on his back of the Devil's Advocate, basically boasting, I think the same time the film The Devil's Advocate come out and boasting that his lawyer at the time, Donald Finlay, had got off with it and he'd got away with murder. Following that, because it was 2 weeks after the Lawrence inquiry, myself and a number of others, the Scottish TUC, the Fire Brigades Union, we approached the family and said, "Look, if you want help, we'll help." We got the Lawrence family on board, and we set up a campaign which, at the time, never thought it was going to grow, because you just wanted answers, simple answers. We wanted a public inquiry, we wanted justice for the family, we wanted the two remaining men prosecuted, we wanted answers why the police discounted the racial motivation instantly after the attack and contacted the Asian Council in areas saying, "Don't go on TV and say it's a racist attack." And we wanted answers to these things, and very quickly it grew into a national campaign on the scale of almost like the Stephen Lawrence campaign down south. And as a result of that, I think at the time, because I think I was asked to do some sort of background in terms of how I became a lawyer. At the time I came back to university, came back to university, I'd worked for the Commission for Racial Equality, and went back to university to do my law degree, and so it was bang in the middle of the Joker campaign. And what happened as a result was that there was 2 inquiries that were set up, judicial inquiries. There was a judge from Northern Ireland, Sir Anthony Campbell, and there was a junior counsel and advocate. The judge from Northern Ireland was to look into the prosecution decision making by the judges and by all the hierarchy in the system in dealing with the Joker case, and how it was that the first trial happened, not guilty. We got second trial, and 2 men walked out of court by blaming the first guy. And the whole issues blew up. And I remember coming out, some of you saw me a few years ago, coming out of the High Court after Mohammed Atif Sadiq's conviction for terrorism, and people told me, I think the Law Society described it as overpassionate and intemperate when I was criticised by the Law Society, and I think the Law Lord said quite a lot more than that in terms of what I said. But if they turned the clock back to 10 years ago, I think they would have got. I remember coming out of the court screaming at the cameras and screaming that there was, lack of justice, that this was racist, and the manner in which the family had been treated. And we had 2 inquiries, and we knew straight away, because it was the Lawrence family that told us, and the lawyers for the Lawrence family, it was Imran Khan, Michael Mansfield, and they said to me, "Alan, watch out, these inquiries are going to be a whitewash. Unless you can get a public inquiry, then you will get a whitewash, because evidence will be given in private, and unless you have the glare of a public spotlight on this case, then you will not get the justice that you're looking for." In the end, the family had to boycott the inquiries. There was times when I saw the mother and father in this case emotionally tired, tears dried up, unable to stand up or walk. They carried on addressing demonstration after demonstration after demonstration to get justice for their son. And after 4 years of struggle, it left an enormous strain on their health and their peace of mind, and there was no opportunity for that family to grieve for their son. And in the end, what we had was a whitewash of an inquiry. But there was some change actually brought about, and I can say that a pleasant surprise that a couple of weeks ago I had to go in and see the Crown over a case of a Chinese man that was murdered in Edinburgh. And we had meetings with the Crown and with the police, and there was a change in attitude, because actually what you had was the family providing interpreters, they were kept in the loop, told about what was going on, the killers were sort of caught, etc., and all this sort of stuff, had actually a completely different attitude, which had taken place as a result of the family's campaign some 10, 12 years ago. And what I would say to you is that the title is radical lawyers. I don't think it's probably an apt one. I think all lawyers should be radical if they want to become lawyers. And the question you should be asking is, what choice do we have, whether it be in the field of immigration law, whether it be in the field of criminal law. Quite often, all that stands between an individual and an accused is the power of the state. Between the accused and the power of the state is an independent defence. And society may not agree with what I like to call radical lawyers, but they are a rich and important tradition of lawyers that speak without fear of favour. And remember, when you signed up to study law, I'm sure that it may have been because in your youth you had watched crime movies, you had read crime novels, you'd watched a bill, whatever it might be, or whatever it might be, the court case where, you know, a man or woman's life and freedoms actually hang in a balance. And I hope it's that actually inspired you to actually go on to want to fight for justice or want to go into law. And I would not let the cynics, I would not let the studies or some of the lecturers tell you that there's no point, you can't fight the system, that you might as well give up the idea of doing commercial law, you might as well give up the idea of doing criminal law, because the money and the jobs are actually in commercial law and there's no money in criminal law. I agree with that, there is no money in criminal law, but that doesn't mean it should be a sole purpose for why you want to do law. And I want to go on to, I mentioned the choker case some 10 years ago, but in September 2007 my client Mohammed Atif Sadiq was found guilty of possessing CDs and videos that gave rise to suspicion that he had them for the purpose connected with the commission, preparation or instigation of a terrorist attack. And he was found guilty in September 2007 after a 6-week trial. There was no suggestion to say that Atif had actually possessed or tried to obtain any actual weapons or bomb-making equipment. His trial started just after the terrorist incident at Glasgow Airport. It ended in the week of the anniversary of 9/11, and after the jury found him guilty, the judge sentenced him to 8 years imprisonment, and he became described by many of the national newspapers as Al-Qaeda terrorist, Alva Al-Qaeda, you know, Scottish terrorist, blah blah blah. This is just a young boy who eventually became described as just a numpty. I mean, that's how he described himself, I was just a numpty. But following that, and I don't mean to put you off, but following that, I remember there was real discussions had within the legal team, and people said to me, you just need to just let it go and make no statements. But the family said, our son's innocent, and this is a disgrace, and we think the trial was a miscarriage of justice. We think the verdict went against us. The trial finished in the week of 9/11, the jury going on, switching on TV and seeing the Osama bin Laden's new video. Then they come into court and seeing this Atif Sadiq and getting the media portraying it, describing it as though some of the evidence that we produced as though that was Atif, and actually was belonging to the Crown witnesses that were flying over from the United States with website details. When we accessed the websites, what we found on one of the Crown experts was that he was an expert on Al-Qaeda and terrorism. But what you found on his website was the world's largest collection of Al-Qaeda videos, which anybody could access. But Mohammed Atif Sadiq, a young boy who'd gone on out of curiosity, which is what he said, to go on the internet to find out what was going on, ends up getting an 8-year jail sentence. And as a result of that, I thought long and hard, and I thought that statement has to be made, because Atif wanted me to make a statement. My family wanted me to make a statement, so I came out onto the steps of the High Court with the family and made a statement which said that this was a tragedy for justice and free speech, that the trial was conducted in an atmosphere of hostility, and we believe that he did not get a fair trial. As a result of which, in October, when Atif received an 8-year sentence, I was told that I would face charges of contempt of court. And 9 months later, I became the first solicitor in the United Kingdom to stand trial for making a statement at the end of a verdict, and stood trial before 3 of Scotland's most senior judges at Edinburgh High Court. I was eventually vindicated some several months later. I was found not guilty, but at the time what I remember was being attacked by the whole legal establishment, who either adopted silence. Practically every lawyer in Scotland refused to sign the petition that some of the students at Glasgow University were responsible for setting up. The vast majority of the lawyers actually backed up and signed the petition were people from the South, civil liberty lawyers, Gareth Pearce, Imran Khan, Mike Mansfield, and many others who signed up and thought it was a disgrace. How exactly is a client who's locked up and handcuffed and sent away into a prison supposed to be able to stay on the steps of the court? I'm an innocent man, because he had no opportunity for it. So the only person that can advocate on his behalf is going to be his solicitor, is going to be his lawyer. In the end, I was found not guilty. Following that, we thought, well, that's the end of it. Now we can just concentrate on active appeal. But then following that, there was a sting in the tail, and there was a Law Society investigation, which went through the loop of having a senior criminal lawyer investigate it, confidentially, didn't know the name of it, investigating for several months, does a cracking report, says I'm not guilty, I'm doing what I've got to do on behalf of my client. This goes to committee. The committee decides to overrule that report and then pass it to another committee and say I should be prosecuted for professional misconduct. We then go to another committee again to basic, and I just thought, is this a kangaroo court? What is going on here? They just want the end result. In the end, what we did was what had been said was that these were my own words. Well, we had actually the mandate and the words signed by Atif Siddique. And what we actually had was, they said this evidence was never led in defence. Atif had never said he wanted to, he was looking out of idle curiosity. That Atif never said, what he said was he said he wanted to be a suicide bomber. But he said it was happening in a classroom like this, arguing with other Muslim girls about, and arguing with people during the war and after the war and stuff, and saying, oh, we could understand why he wanted to be a suicide bomber. But as a result of that, that was the glue that hung all the case together to send him to praise, because he said some 2-3 years earlier in the classroom, I want to be a suicide bomber. I know some people say many daft things. People say I want to be a suicide bomber. Some people say they want to be like Beckham. Some people say they want to be like whatever. It doesn't mean they actually become it. What counts is what action do you take in order to carry it through. As a result of that, we then went on to do Atif's appeal. I was eventually cleared by the Law Society, went on to do Atif's appeal, and in February of this year, Mohammed Atif Siddique came out of the steps of the High Court as a free man. And what I said prior to that and what I said at the time is that if there's one right prized above all others in democracy, it's freedom of speech. Lawyers, like everybody else, enjoy that fundamental right. The ability to speak one's mind, to challenge the political orthodoxies of the time, to criticise the policies of the government without fear of recrimination is an essential distinction between life in a free country and a dictatorship. And 33 years ago, more than 20 innocent Irish men and women were branded as terrorists and convicted by the courts. The lack of protest over their imprisonment was a badge of shame for this country. Today, for all the talk of justice, our government has criminalised communities and created thought crime under new terror laws. I finished it off by saying I was taught it's a lawyer's duty to fight fearlessly on behalf of his clients, no matter what crimes they're accused of or how demonised they are hated by society. At the time I came out, I don't often get to do this because people think Aamer's a sour-faced bastard when he goes on TV and never smiles. That's one of the only times I can think of actually coming out in February with a smile on my face thinking, well, anybody watching that will say, will get the message that as lawyers, as campaigners, we shouldn't give up fighting, because at the end of the day, we're not having to suffer anything. It's the people who are inside prison who are spending 8 years, spending 16 years, spending 86 years, still living in conditions like Guantanamo or Belmarsh, going completely out of their mind because of the horrors inflicted by the state, that are actually really suffering. And everybody likes to talk about the independence of the judiciary and the prosecution, but if you don't have an independent defence, you don't have an independent defence able to speak out, then you don't have a justice system. And in the 60s and the 70s, I think it took a lot of courage for radical lawyers to speak up on behalf of their clients. People like Michael Mansfield and others, and Gareth Pearce, who started out at that time, not least because their own professional bodies were suspicious of them, but it was a time when you actually had defendants alleged to have committed serious crimes such as terrorism, and all of a sudden you had lawyer after lawyer after lawyer after lawyer refusing to represent these people. And you had a small group of people that became known as the alternative bar that said they wanted to represent them, and they acted vigorously, and then all of a sudden these people were accused of being terrorist sympathisers.